So CNN finally did a town hall with Bernie Sanders, and one of the questions that was asked of Bernie Sanders had to do with the sexual harassment allegations against Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. Now, I want to show you guys this video, and then I'm going to give my commentary at the end. Let's take a look.
We have a question from Shadi Nassab, a student at American University. Shadi's from Denver.
As we saw in the 2018 midterms, the Democratic Party has become more female, more racially diverse, and younger in age. How can a voter like me feel confident in your ability to represent the party, especially given that your response to sexual harassment allegations during your campaign is that you were, quote, a little bit busy running around the country trying to make the case to be elected as president?
Well, I think that quote was a little bit out of context. But let me ask you a question. I am enormously proud of the fact that we have the most diverse, progressive freshman class in the history of the United States Congress. And you know what I did in 2016 and in 2018? I ran all over this country to try to make that happen. All right, so when you talk about the political revolution, you're talking about two things. Number one are the ideas that we are fighting for. An economy that works for all, not just the 1%. But the second point that I have made over and over again is we're not going to be able to implement a progressive agenda unless millions more people get involved in the political process. So I am delighted. We started an organization called Our Revolution. I think Nina Turner is here. You know what the purpose of Our Revolution was about? Is precisely to bring young people into the political process. And I think we're making some real progress.
But what are you going to do, Senator, to make sure that the allegations that occurred against your campaign a couple of years ago are not repeated? What are you personally going to do to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Let me tell you what we have done and what we are doing. I was very upset to learn what I learned. When I ran for re-election in Vermont in 2018, we instituted, I think, maybe the strongest protocols against sexual harassment, and that will be the protocols we bring into the 2020 presidential election. Every employee of mine in this campaign will get significant amounts of training to understand what sexual harassment is about. Anybody who feels harassed will have an independent entity to speak to outside of the campaign. And we have hired some of the best people in the country to help us on this issue. We take this issue very, very seriously.
How has it affected you personally, knowing what happened?
It was very painful, and it will not happen again.
So there are a lot of things about this response from Bernie Sanders that I want to talk about. I have mixed feelings about this response. In one way, like, we have to accept first off that the sexual harassment allegations were involved in the 2016 campaign that Bernie Sanders couldn't have really known about. Like, it was absolutely separate from Bernie Sanders. And the only possible way of solving the problem would be a systemic solution to the actual functioning of your campaign. So let me explain it in this way. If you run a campaign, right, you run the risk of sexual assault, you run the risk of sexual harassment in your campaign. There's, like, you can't 100% avoid that because, you know, some people do stupid things. However, what you can do is you can create systemic solutions. And so the idea is that Bernie Sanders had already in place really good solutions for this. And the way he handled it was great. Essentially, he didn't. He let the campaign figure it out. They have like an HR and everything, right? Bernie Sanders was busy doing other things. And that was why his quote was taken out of context, because, like, he was saying, like, listen, like, that was HR's deal. I was doing campaigns. I was going around doing rallies. And so, to me, what Bernie Sanders did here was he accepted defeat. He said, listen, yeah, it was a problem. I hate it. Don't like it. And I don't like that. But the thing is, I understand why Bernie Sanders did this. Because if he comes out and says, listen, I couldn't have done anything, CNN's going to frame him as this jerk, right? And they're going to say, like, listen, he supports sexual assault or whatever, right? So it's essentially a lose-lose for Bernie Sanders. It's a smear on Bernie Sanders. And so I think the way Bernie Sanders managed it was as good as it can get. But I think people need to understand the context behind what happened in order to truly understand the merit of Bernie Sanders' question to the main content of this question, which was, how can we trust you as progressives? How can Black people trust you? How can the diverse progressive base, how can they trust you? His response to that aspect of the question was brilliant and great and perfect. And his response was this: policy. Like, what a great question. So listen, we have all these systemic issues. We solve them with systemic solutions. And so this is what we do. We have a political revolution where we solve the biggest problems. Like, for example, income inequality. We solve income inequality. Systemic issue solved. Moving on now, right? It's policy. Policy is what solves these issues. Now, if she had asked a more specific problem, which happened to all the other Democratic nominees, didn't happen with Bernie Sanders. Like other nominees were asked, for example, what are you going to do about Black Lives Matter or social injustice against the Black community, right? That would have been a great question because it's very specific and you can respond with specific policies. But it was a general and vague question, and therefore Bernie Sanders gave a general and vague response. And his response was policy. We have this our revolution or whatever it was called. I can't remember. Where millions of young people or hundreds of thousands of young people are signing up. He wants 1 million to sign up to get involved in political activism. That's how you get things done, guys, is actual genuine policy. And that's the thing that Hillary Clinton lacked. It's the thing that every other Democratic nominee lacks. And this is something that everyone needs to be attentive of, is that you can say all you want, I am a social justice warrior and I support the Black community. However, once you get down to the crux of the issue, like, for example, how are you going to solve the systemic crisis of income inequality in the Black community? That's one of the most important issues to the Black community, which I know a lot of people are thinking like, oh, police brutality is the biggest issue with the Black community. Wrong. It's income inequality. That's the number one issue that everyone cares about right now. Black people make far less than white people. And that is a huge issue. That leads to a lot of other problems. And so Bernie Sanders is just like, let's solve income inequality. There you go. How many other Democratic candidates have suggested that we need to tackle income inequality? 0. So that's the solution. And on top of that, like, in terms of diversity, Bernie Sanders gained so much popularity in 2016. And I want to emphasize a couple things. A lot of other progressive outlets, unfortunately, are misrepresenting what happened in 2016. So Bernie Sanders won the Rust Belt. He won that basically the Northeast states. Now, he didn't win by popularity, but he certainly won by districts. He won like if you look at the region if you look at the U.S. map and the popularity vote when it's broken up by district, you can see Bernie Sanders had like the entire Rust Belt. He had a really good diverse region, but the thing was that he was running on economic policy. And he didn't really emphasize so much as social policy. Hillary Clinton came out there and said, listen, I'm going to care for the Black community. I'm going to care for the Asian community and so on, the minorities, the illegal immigrants. She came out there as the social justice warrior. But then about halfway through the campaign, you can see in the polls that Bernie Sanders was rising in popularity. And the reason for that is because there were countless questions to Hillary Clinton. How are you going to solve the systemic issues? How are you going to address these things? What are the policies? What are you going to do? Like, great, I'm glad you care about us. Thank you for emphasizing so hard and spending millions of dollars to tell us that you care. Now, can you tell us what you're going to do about that? Or are you just going to sit there? And Hillary Clinton just sat there and said, I'm a social justice warrior. Right? Whereas Bernie Sanders said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And they asked specific policy questions in the debates, and he had amazing responses. And all of a sudden, his popularity is gaining. Bernie Sanders is gaining popularity. Unfortunately, that popularity, that rise in popularity, which was insanely fast, by the way, it wasn't enough to meet the amount of delegates that he needed. And yes, the DNC spent so much money for Hillary Clinton, and it was insanely unfair for Bernie Sanders. But here's the thing, guys. He didn't win the popular vote. And yeah, there was a lot of propaganda. I understand that, but he didn't win the popular vote, and that's because no one really understood who he was in 2016. And progressive outlets need to understand that. They need to understand that no one knew about him. And that was the problem. The problem was people didn't hear his messages. And so that's going to change in 2020, because now people have heard him, and now people are realizing, like, wow, this dude is certainly the most popular member of Congress in all of history. Like, this guy is overwhelmingly popular. And he's going to beat Donald Trump in a heartbeat because of his great policy that people now recognize. And so it was a great response. But again, he submitted defeat. And I don't really like that. So